What happens when the system designed to protect you decides you're not worth protecting? For the officers of the 14th Precinct, it was just another Tuesday, another complaint to be dismissed. They saw a black man, frustrated and angry about crime in his mother's neighborhood, and they saw a nuisance. They laughed him off, ignored his pleas, and told him to fill out a form. They never imagined that the man they were disrespecting held the power to dismantle their entire world. They were about to learn that justice isn't always blind, and sometimes it walks right through your front door wearing a tailored suit. The neighborhood felt smaller than Marcus Thorne remembered. The sprawling oak trees that had once seemed like giants, their branches forming a protective canopy over the street, now seemed weary, their leaves tinged with the dust of a city that had moved on. This was where he grew up, in this modest two-story home with the slightly crooked porch swing his father had installed 30 years ago. He was here to visit his mother, Eleanor Thorne, a woman whose spirit was as resilient as the old oaks, but whose body was beginning to show the wear of 82 years. Marcus, dressed in a simple pair of dark jeans and a grey polo shirt, sat at his mother's kitchen table, a chipped ceramic mug of coffee warming his hands. The aroma of cinnamon and old wood filled the air, a scent he equated with safety and home. But that feeling was being eroded. "It's the third time this month on this block alone," Eleanor said, her voice a mixture of frustration and fear. She was tracing the rim of her own mug with a wrinkled finger. "The Carsons next door, they had their garden shed broken into. Last week, Mrs. Gable found someone had jimmied her back window. They didn't take much, just her television. It's not about the things, Marcus. It's the feeling of being unsafe in your own home." Marcus felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He'd built his entire career on a foundation of law and order, on the principle that every citizen deserved to feel secure. To hear that this sense of violation had crept onto his mother's doorstep felt like a personal failure. "Mum, have you called the police? Filed a report?" he asked, keeping his tone even. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, of course. They send a car. An officer younger than your last suit takes a few notes on a little pad, says, 'Be more careful, keep your doors locked,' and drives away. Nothing ever happens. They see an old woman in an old neighborhood, and they file it under low priority." This was the core of the problem. This part of the city, once a thriving middle-class community, was now considered transitional. The city's resources flowed to the newer, wealthier suburbs, leaving neighborhoods like this one to fend for themselves. The residents paid their taxes, but they received a fraction of the services. "I'll go down there myself," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I'll talk to them. Make sure they understand this isn't just a random incident. It's a pattern, and it's targeting the elderly. They have to take it seriously." Eleanor looked at her son, seeing the fire in his eyes that had propelled him from this small house to the heights of the legal world. "Just be careful, son. Don't you go making trouble." "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus replied, standing up and placing his mug in the sink. "I'm looking for a response. There's a difference." An hour later, Marcus Thorne walked into the 14th Precinct. The air was stale, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant. A heavy-set officer with a florid face and a name tag that read Miller sat behind a plexiglass barrier, scrolling idly through his phone. He didn't look up until Marcus cleared his throat. "Excuse me, officer," Marcus said. Officer Miller's eyes flicked up, taking in Marcus's appearance with a slow, dismissive gaze. "Yeah? What can I do for you?" "I'd like to speak to someone about a series of break-ins in the Oakdale neighborhood, specifically on Elm Street. My mother lives there. and there's a clear pattern of elderly residents being targeted. Miller leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Oakdale, huh? Yeah, we get calls from there. You fill out a report? My mother has. Multiple residents have. The issue is that nothing is being done. No follow-up, no increased patrols. These are vulnerable citizens and they feel abandoned. A second officer, younger and leaner, with Davis on his name tag, sauntered over. Look, sir, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. We're a busy precinct. We prioritize violent crime. A few B&Es in a neighborhood like that. It happens. Tell your mum to get a better look. The knot in Marcus's stomach coiled tighter. It was the casual dismissal, the thinly veiled disdain. A neighborhood like that? Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What kind of neighborhood is that, officer? Miller chuckled. He means a neighborhood where people should know better than to leave their windows unlocked. Now, if you want to file another report, you can take a number and fill out the paperwork. Otherwise, we're busy. He gestured vaguely to a stack of forms on a counter before turning his attention back to his phone. The universal signal for, this conversation is over. Marcus stood there for a moment, the institutional apathy washing over him like a cold wave. He wasn't just a concerned son anymore. He was a citizen being denied the basic function of a police force. He knew the law, he knew their obligations, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that they were failing. He walked over, took a form, and felt the cheap, flimsy paper in his hand. This was the barrier they put between the people and their duty. For now, he would play their game. But the game was about to change. Marcus filled out the form with meticulous detail, his penmanship sharp and precise. He listed the dates of the known incidents, the addresses, the names of the victims, and the nature of the crimes. He wasn't just filing a complaint. He was creating a record, a piece of evidence. When he finished, he walked back to the desk. Officer Miller was gone, replaced by Davis, who was now deeply engrossed in a conversation with a female officer, laughing loudly. Marcus waited patiently. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Davis clearly saw him standing there, but deliberately ignored him, making a show of continuing his story. Finally, with an exaggerated sigh, he turned to Marcus. "Oh, you still here? Finished with your homework?" he asked with a sneer. Marcus placed the form on the counter. "I've documented the pattern of criminal activity as requested. I'd like this to be escalated to a detective, and I want to speak with the watch commander or the sergeant in charge." Davis picked up the form, glanced at it for less than a second, and tossed it into a wire basket, already overflowing with paper. "It's in the queue. Sergeant Evans is busy. Someone will look at it when they have time." "I have time to wait," Marcus said, his jaw set. He crossed his arms and stood his ground. He wasn't leaving until he spoke to someone with authority. This act of quiet defiance seemed to infuriate Davis. His easygoing smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Look, pal, I don't think you get it. This isn't a customer service desk. You don't get to make demands. You go home, and if, and I mean if, we have an update, someone will call the number you left. Now beat it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I'm not your pal," Marcus said, his voice low and steely. "I'm a taxpayer and a resident of this city, reporting a credible threat to a vulnerable community, and I am asking to speak to your superior. That is not a demand. It is my right." The commotion attracted the attention of a man who emerged from a back office. He was older than the other two, with a thick neck, a graying crew cut, and a prominent belly that strained against the buttons of his uniform. His name tag read Sergeant Evans. He had the weary, cynical eyes of a man who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. "What's the problem out here, Davis?" he grumbled. "No problem, Sarge," Davis said, suddenly shifting his posture to one of feigned diligence. "This gentleman is just having a hard time understanding procedure." Sergeant Evans turned his tired eyes on Marcus. "What's your issue?" Marcus calmly repeated his story for the third time. He explained the string of break-ins, the targeting of the elderly, and the complete lack of a meaningful police response. He spoke clearly and respectfully, laying out the facts without emotion. Evans listened, his expression unchanging. When Marcus finished, the sergeant took a deep breath, as if preparing for a long, tedious explanation to a child. "Son, do you have any idea how many reports we get a day?" he began, his voice a low rumble. "Burglaries, domestics, assaults, traffic accidents. The whole 9 yards. We have to triage. A stolen TV in Oakdale doesn't get the same attention as a shooting downtown. That's just reality. We don't have the manpower." "With all due respect, Sergeant," Marcus countered, "this isn't about a stolen TV. It's about a predator, or predators, who have identified a neighborhood full of senior citizens as easy targets. The value of the goods is irrelevant. The failure to act now could lead to something far worse. What if one of these residents walks in on a burglar? What if they get hurt or killed?" Evans waved a dismissive hand. "You're getting ahead of yourself. We're not fortune tellers. We respond to crimes that have been committed. We've taken the reports. The system is working." "The system is failing," Marcus stated, his voice ringing with a conviction that made Evans's eyes narrow. "It's failing because officers like Miller and Davis treat citizens with contempt, and because their superiors like you hide behind the excuse of being understaffed instead of engaging in proactive policing." A tense silence fell over the lobby. Sergeant Evans took a step closer to the plexiglass barrier, his face hardening. "You've got a real mouth on you, you know that. You think you can come in here and tell us how to do our jobs? You've filed your report. Your business here is done. I suggest you leave before I find a reason for you to stay." The threat was unmistakable. It was a crude display of power, the last resort of a man who had no logical argument left. Marcus held the sergeant's gaze for a long moment. He could push it further. He could quote municipal codes and police department regulations until he was blue in the face. But he knew it would be pointless. He had hit a wall of indifference built brick by brick over years of neglect and prejudice. He nodded slowly. "I see," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "Thank you for clarifying the department's position on the safety of its citizens." He turned and walked out of the precinct, the sound of Davis's snickering following him into the afternoon sun. They thought they had won. They thought they had dismissed another nobody. They had no idea that they hadn't just dismissed a complaint. They had initiated a reckoning. 2 days passed. The silence from the 14th precinct was as profound as it was predictable. Marcus had stayed at his mother's house, unable to bring himself to leave her alone. He installed a new, high-security deadbolt on her front door and reinforced the frame of the back door. He checked the window locks, making sure each one was secure. They were small measures, temporary fixes for a problem that required a systemic solution. He and his mother fell into a comfortable routine, but an undercurrent of anxiety ran beneath it all. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every car that slowed down on the street, was a source of fresh tension. The call came on Thursday evening. Marcus was in the living room, reading a book, while his mother was in the kitchen, humming along to an old jazz station on the radio. His phone buzzed, and the name Mrs. Gable flashed on the screen. She was their neighbor from 2 doors down, a sweet but frail woman of 85. "Marcus, you have to come. It's your mother's house." Her voice was thin and trembling with panic. Marcus's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Gable? I'm here. Mum's in the kitchen." No, the back. I saw it from my window. The kitchen window is broken. Someone smashed it." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mum!" he yelled, sprinting toward the kitchen. He found her standing by the sink, a dish towel clutched in her hands, staring at the shattered pane of glass in the back window. Shards littered the linoleum floor. The cool night air poured in, carrying with it the scent of cut grass and something else, the metallic, acrid smell of violation. They just threw a rock," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her entire body was trembling. Marcus moved to her side, putting a protective arm around her. His eyes scanned the room. The thief had been clumsy, but quick. A drawer was pulled open, its contents strewn on the counter. And then he saw it. The small, velvet-lined jewelry box that always sat on the windowsill was gone. "The box," Eleanor breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "Marcus." They took the box. It wasn't valuable, not in terms of money. It contained a few pieces of costume jewelry and one item of infinite worth, a small silver locket. It had been a gift from his father on their 20th anniversary, and inside were two tiny faded photographs, one of him and one of his sister, as children. It was the last gift he had ever given her before he passed away. A rage unlike anything Marcus had ever felt surged through him. It was cold and sharp and utterly focused. This wasn't about a broken window or a stolen box anymore. This was a desecration. They had stolen a piece of his mother's heart, a piece of their family's history, and it had happened because the people sworn to prevent it couldn't be bothered. He called 911. It took 45 minutes for a car to arrive. By sheer, bitter irony, it was Miller and Davis. They sauntered up the walkway as if they were responding to a noise complaint. "Evening," Miller said, a look of dawning recognition on his face as he saw Marcus. Well, look who it is. Couldn't stay away, huh?" "My mother's house was just broken into," Marcus said, his voice dangerously level. "The back window was smashed. They stole personal items from the kitchen." Davis peered at the broken window from the porch, not even bothering to step inside. "You sure she didn't just leave it open? An old house like this, these old windows can be tricky." "A rock was thrown through it, officer," Marcus bit out, his patience worn to a thread. "Are you going to investigate, or are you just going to stand there making baseless assumptions?" Miller let out a sigh, pulling out his notepad with theatrical reluctance. All right, keep your shirt on. What was taken?" "A jewelry box. It contained a silver locket of immense sentimental value." Davis snorted. "Sentimental value, right. So, nothing of real value then. Look, we'll take the report. Dust for prints, though I doubt we'll find anything usable. Probably some kids. They'll hawk the box for a few bucks and that'll be the end of it." The callousness was breathtaking. They weren't just indifferent, they were contemptuous. They saw his mother's pain as an inconvenience. Marcus looked from their smug faces to his mother, who was now sitting at the kitchen table, silently weeping. That was it. That was the moment everything crystallized. He had tried the proper channels. He had tried to be a concerned citizen, a respectful son. He had followed their procedures, filled out their forms, and endured their disrespect. And this was the result. His mother, terrified and heartbroken in her own home. He took a deep, calming breath, the rage inside him cooling into something harder and more resolute. "Steele." "Okay, officers," he said softly. The sudden change in his tone made them both look at him. Thank you for coming. You can go now." Miller looked confused. "We haven't finished the report." "That won't be necessary," Marcus said, his eyes locking on to Sergeant Evans, who had just pulled up in a separate car, likely to supervise. "I have all the information I need." Evans got out of his car and swaggered over. "Heard there was some excitement. So the boy who cried wolf finally saw one, eh?" Marcus ignored him and looked directly at Miller and Davis. "Your negligence has now led to a direct consequence. Your sergeant's apathy has enabled it. I gave you every opportunity to do your job. Every single one." He pulled out his phone, not to call anyone, but to send a single, pre-written text message. The message contained just 2 words: "Execute now." He put the phone back in his pocket and looked at the 3 officers who were watching him with a mixture of amusement and suspicion. "You're right, Sergeant," Marcus said, his voice now devoid of any warmth. "My business at your precinct was done, but my work is just beginning." He turned his back on them and walked into the house to comfort his mother, leaving the 3 men standing in the yard, utterly oblivious to the storm that was about to break over their heads. The next morning, Marcus Thorne was not in his mother's modest home. He was in his own. A sprawling corner office on the top floor of the State Justice Building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city's gleaming downtown skyline. The seal of the State Attorney General was emblazoned on the wall behind his large mahogany desk. Law books, not of a student but of a master, lined the shelves. This was his world, the one the officers of the 14th Precinct couldn't have possibly imagined. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep red tie. The casual, concerned son was gone. In his place was Marcus Thorne, the chief law enforcement officer of the entire state. Across the desk from him sat Sarah Jenkins, his chief of staff, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had been with him for over a decade. On the desk between them was a preliminary file. It was thin, but it was growing by the minute. "The message was received, Marcus," Sarah said, her voice all business. "The investigative team is on standby. We've already pulled the internal data from the Northwood Police Department's 14th Precinct. The numbers are alarming." She slid a tablet across the desk. Marcus picked it up. On the screen were charts and graphs that painted a grim picture. Complaint closure rates in affluent districts were over 60%. In districts like Oakdale, they were less than 10%. Response times in the northern suburbs averaged 4 minutes. In his mother's neighborhood, they averaged 40. There was a 300% higher rate of citizen complaints filed against the 14th Precinct for negligence and misconduct compared to any other precinct in the city, with the vast majority being dismissed without a full investigation. "It's a pattern," Marcus said, his voice a low growl, "a systemic, calculated neglect of duty based on geography and demography." "Worse," Sarah added. "We cross-referenced personnel files. Officers Miller and Davis have a dozen misconduct complaints between them, all dismissed by their superior, Sergeant Evans. Evans himself has a history of burying complaints against officers he favors. The precinct captain, a man named Richards, seems to have a completely hands-off approach. It's a fiefdom, not a police precinct." Marcus's finger traced a line on the tablet screen. "Last night, they stood in my mother's yard and mocked my family's distress. They treated her like she was nothing, a statistic they could ignore. They don't understand the oath they took. They see the badge as a shield for their prejudice, not a symbol of their duty." "So what's the plan?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. They had discussed this contingency for years, how to address systemic rot when they found it. They just never thought Marcus would find it on his own mother's doorstep. "No warning," Marcus said, standing and walking to the window, his back to her. He looked down at the city below, a complex tapestry of lives and communities, all of whom deserved equal protection under the law. We're not calling the Chief of Police. We're not sending a formal notice to Captain Richards. That gives them time to shred documents and align their stories. We are going to conduct a full, unannounced audit and operational review, effective immediately. He turned back to face her. Get me the head of the Special Investigations Unit. I want his top 3 people. We're also bringing in 2 forensic accountants from the Financial Crimes Division. I want to see their overtime logs, their asset forfeiture records, everything. I want body cam footage from every officer in that precinct for the last 72 hours, pulled and preserved. And you? Sarah asked. A grim smile touched Marcus's lips. I'm going back to the 14th precinct. Last time I went as a son. This time I'm going as the Attorney General. He paused, his mind flashing back to his mother's tear-streaked face. And Sarah, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper, find my mother's locket. Use every resource we have. I don't care what it takes. Find it. For the rest of the morning, Marcus's office was a whirlwind of quiet, focused activity. Phone calls were made, warrants were drafted. A team of the state's most elite investigators was assembled in a conference room down the hall, their faces grim as they were briefed on the situation. They were looking at files, maps, and personnel charts. Marcus Thorne was no longer just a man angry about a crime. He was a force of nature, wielding the full power of the state. He was sharpening the sword of justice, and the officers of the 14th precinct were about to feel its edge. At 2:15 p.m. sharp, a procession of 3 black sedans pulled up to the curb in front of the 14th precinct. They were unmarked, but they moved with an authority that made pedestrians stop and stare. The doors opened in unison. From the lead car, Marcus Thorne emerged. He was flanked by 2 stern-faced individuals, lead investigator David Chen and senior auditor Maria Flores. 6 other plainclothes agents fanned out, securing the entrance. The lobby of the 14th precinct was just as dreary as it had been 2 days ago. Officer Davis was at the desk, laughing at something on his computer monitor. He looked up, annoyed by the sudden influx of people, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. It was immediately followed by a wave of contempt. "Oh, for crying out loud. You again?" Davis said, leaning back in his chair with a theatrical groan. "I told you. We'll call you if we find anything. You can't just keep showing up here. This is a police station, not a community center." Marcus didn't stop at the plexiglass barrier. He walked straight toward the secured door that led into the precinct's main offices, his team following silently behind him. Davis shot to his feet, his face turning red with anger. "Hey, where the hell do you think you're going? That's a restricted area. You take one more step and I'll arrest you for trespassing." Marcus stopped just before the door. He turned his head slowly, his gaze so cold and intense that Davis involuntarily took a step back. "Your name is Officer Michael Davis, badge number 724, Marcus said, his voice calm and clear. Yet it echoed through the silent lobby like a judge's gavel. "You've been with the NPD for 4 years. You have 6 citizen complaints filed against you for verbal abuse and 2 for dereliction of duty. All of them were dismissed internally by Sergeant Evans." Davis's jaw went slack. How do you know that?" Marcus gave him no answer. He turned to the secured door, which required a key card. He simply looked at the electronic lock, then back at Davis. He didn't need to say a word. The command was implicit. Behind him, Officer Miller came rushing out from a side room, a half-eaten donut in his hand. "What's all the commotion? Davis, what's going on?" He saw Marcus and scowled. "You've got to be kidding me. This guy again? That's it. I'm booking him for harassment of a public official." As Miller reached for his handcuffs, Investigator Chen stepped forward, subtly blocking his path. Chen was a man of average height, but he moved with a coiled energy that promised swift, decisive action. He simply held up his credentials. The gold shield gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "State Office of the Attorney General, Special Investigations Unit," Chen said flatly. "Stand down, officer." Miller froze, his eyes wide, as he looked from the badge to Marcus, then back again. The pieces were starting to click into place, but the picture they were forming was so impossible, so terrifying, that his brain refused to accept it. At that moment, Sergeant Evans burst out of his office, his face a mask of fury. "What in God's name is happening out here? I told you to get rid of this guy." His tirade was cut short as he saw the cadre of stone-faced agents standing in his lobby. He saw their suits, their professional demeanor, and the unmistakable air of authority that surrounded them. His eyes finally landed on Marcus, the man he had threatened and dismissed just 2 days prior. "Who the hell are you people?" Evans demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier bluster. Marcus turned to face him fully. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his own identification. He didn't flash it. He held it up for Evans to see clearly, the official seal of the state and the boldly printed title beneath his name. "Sergeant Evans," Marcus said, his voice resonating with the full weight of his office. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I am the Attorney General for the state of, and as of this moment, your precinct is the subject of an official state investigation into systemic misconduct, dereliction of duty, and potential criminal negligence." The silence that followed was absolute. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Miller's donut fell from his hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. Davis looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face pale and clammy. Sergeant Evans stared at the ID, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. The man he had called son in the most condescending way possible, the man he had threatened to arrest, was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the state. He was staring into the face of the man who held his entire career, his pension, and his freedom in the palm of his hand. "Now," Attorney General Thorne continued, his voice like ice, "you will open this door. You will instruct your officers not to touch, delete, or destroy any files, electronic or physical. My team will be conducting a full audit. You, Sergeant Evans, along with Officers Miller and Davis, will be confined to the briefing room for questioning. Is that understood?" It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The reckoning had arrived. The atmosphere inside the 14th precinct transformed instantly from one of stagnant indifference to one of panicked, frantic energy. Marcus's team moved with the cold efficiency of a surgical unit. Investigators began securing computer terminals, auditors started pulling financial records, and uniformed state troopers, who had arrived moments after Marcus's entry, stood guard at the exits. The precinct was on lockdown. Marcus Thorne walked through the bullpen, his footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Officers who had been lounging at their desks minutes before now sat ramrod straight, avoiding his gaze as if it could physically burn them. He didn't look at them. His focus was on Sergeant Evans's office. He entered without knocking. The office was small and cluttered, the walls covered in yellowed commendations and pictures of Evans on fishing trips. It smelled of stale cigars. Marcus walked behind the desk and sat in Evans's own chair. It felt fitting. Investigator Chen escorted Evans, Miller, and Davis into the main briefing room. The 3 officers, who had wielded their minor authority with such arrogance, were now reduced to frightened men, stripped of their power. They sat at a long table, their hands placed in front of them, looking like suspects in their own station. Chen started with Miller. "Officer Miller, 2 nights ago, You responded to a B&E call at 214 Elm Street. Is that correct? Yes, sir, Miller mumbled, his face slick with sweat. Your report, which you filed this morning, nearly 36 hours after the incident, states you conducted a thorough search of the premises and canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. Is that an accurate summary? Yes, sir. Chen placed a small tablet on the table and pressed play. It was body cam footage. Their body cam footage. It showed Miller and Davis standing on Eleanor Thorne's lawn, mocking Marcus, making jokes about sentimental value, and leaving after less than 10 minutes. It showed no canvassing, no thorough search. It showed them getting back in their car, with Davis saying, "Let's just mark it unfounded, no leads, and grab some pizza." Miller's face went ashen. He had assumed, like always, that no one would ever bother to look. "That," Chen said, his voice dangerously soft, "is falsifying a police report. A felony." Next was Davis. "Officer Davis, when Mr. Thorne first came to the precinct, you told him to beat it and referred to his formal complaint as homework. You then logged his complaint as non-urgent citizen dispute. Can you explain that classification?" Davis stammered. I must have misclicked. It was a mistake." Auditor Maria Flores stepped forward, holding a thick binder. "Your mistake seems to happen frequently, officer. Our preliminary audit shows that over 80% of complaints originating from the Oakdale and similar districts are classified as non-urgent, while nearly 90% of complaints from the affluent North Hills district are classified as priority. Can you explain this statistical anomaly?" Davis had no answer. He just stared at the table, his career dissolving before his eyes. Finally, Marcus's voice came over an intercom, patched in from the sergeant's office. It was calm, controlled, and utterly devastating. "Sergeant Evans." Evans flinched as if he'd been shocked. "Yes, sir. I came to you as a citizen." Marcus's voice filled the room. "I warned you that a predator was targeting the elderly in my mother's neighborhood. I told you that your officers were dismissive and that a failure to act could have serious consequences. Do you recall your response?" Evans remained silent, his head bowed. "You told me I had a real mouth on me," Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "You threatened me. You stood behind a wall of bureaucratic excuses and did nothing. 2 days later, my mother's home was invaded. Your willful negligence created the environment for that crime to happen. You failed in your most fundamental duty, to protect and serve." Marcus paused. The silence stretched, thick with dread. "This is no longer about a few dismissed complaints," the Attorney General's voice boomed. "Investigator Chen has just uncovered a series of impound and asset forfeiture reports signed by you, Sergeant. It appears you have a habit of seizing vehicles and property from suspects in low-income districts, which are then sold at auction with the paperwork mysteriously incomplete. It seems being understaffed hasn't stopped you from running a very profitable side business." The color drained completely from Sergeant Evans's face. This was no longer about losing his job. This was about going to prison. The precinct's captain, a portly, balding man named Richards, finally arrived, flustered and out of breath. He had been at a long lunch and had ignored the initial frantic calls. He burst into his station to find it occupied by the state's highest law enforcement office. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered, trying to project an authority he no longer had. Marcus met him in the hallway. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Captain Richards," Marcus said, "you are the commanding officer of this precinct. The rot that has festered here did so under your command. Either you were aware of it and complicit, or you were so incompetent you didn't notice. Either way, as of this moment, you are relieved of your command. Please hand over your badge and service weapon to the state trooper at the door." The unraveling was swift and total. It was more than just 3 officers being caught. It was the exposure of an entire culture of corruption and neglect that had been allowed to flourish in the dark. Marcus Thorne had not just brought a complaint, he had brought the light. And the cockroaches were scattering. The investigation into the 14th precinct dominated the local news for weeks. What started with Marcus Thorne's personal experience quickly spiraled into a full-blown civic scandal. The forensic accountants discovered that Sergeant Evans was at the center of a scheme involving tow truck companies and scrap yards, skimming profits from impounded vehicles. The break-ins in Oakdale weren't being investigated because the officers were too busy shaking down minor offenders for cash. Officers Miller and Davis, facing felony charges for falsifying reports and the threat of additional charges, confessed everything. They detailed how Sergeant Evans had fostered a culture where police work was about generating revenue and avoiding effort. They were fired immediately, their careers in law enforcement over. They would eventually plead guilty in exchange for their testimony against Evans. Sergeant Evans himself was facing a mountain of charges, from obstruction of justice and official misconduct to racketeering. His blustering arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the quiet desperation of a man who knew his life was over. The system he had so skillfully manipulated to his own benefit had now turned on him with merciless efficiency. But for Marcus, the most important thread of the investigation was the one closest to home, the burglary ring targeting his mother's neighborhood. With the state's resources now fully engaged, it didn't take long to find the culprits. They were a pair of local meth addicts who had been exploiting the precinct's well-known slow response times. They would smash a window, grab whatever they could, and be gone in under 2 minutes, knowing it would be at least half an hour before any police car showed up. Investigator Chen led the team that raided their squalid apartment. Amid the stolen electronics and cheap jewelry, they found it, a small, velvet-lined box, and inside, nestled amongst gaudy costume rings, was a simple silver locket, slightly tarnished but unharmed. That evening, Marcus drove back to his mother's house. He bypassed the new security system he'd had installed and found her sitting on the porch swing, a blanket over her lap. She looked older, more fragile than she had just a week ago. He sat down beside her, the old swing groaning softly. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. He opened his palm and showed it to her. Eleanor Thorne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears instantly filled her eyes, but these were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of profound relief. She took the locket, her trembling fingers tracing the familiar engravings. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered. "How?" "The people who took it have been arrested," he said softly, "and the police officers who let it happen. They are being held accountable." He told her everything. Not the legal details of racketeering or the intricacies of the state investigation, but the heart of it. He told her how he had walked into that precinct, not just as her son, but as a man with the power to demand justice, not just for her, but for everyone they had ignored. She listened, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your father would be so proud," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He always said you had a fire in you for what's right. He just never knew how bright it would burn." A few days later, Attorney General Marcus Thorne stood at a podium before a phalanx of news cameras. He announced sweeping reforms for the Northwood Police Department, a new civilian oversight committee, mandatory retraining on community policing, and a state-of-the-art system for tracking and analyzing citizen complaints to identify patterns of misconduct early. he announced the indictment of Sergeant Evans and 7 other officers from the 14th Precinct. He was poised, professional, and powerful. But as he spoke about the duty to protect the most vulnerable members of society, his gaze drifted for a moment. In his mind's eye, he wasn't seeing the reporters or the cameras. He was seeing his mother, sitting on her porch swing, clutching a silver locket to her heart. And he knew that this, all of this, was what justice truly looked like. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about restoring what had been stolen, be it a precious memory or a community's sense of safety. 6 months had passed since the day the 14th Precinct was turned inside out. Autumn had arrived in Oakdale, painting the leaves of the weary oak trees in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. A crispness in the air felt like a fresh start. Marcus Thorne walked alongside his mother, Eleanor, down the familiar sidewalk of Elm Street. The porch swing he'd repaired sat empty, but for the first time in a long time, it looked inviting rather than vulnerable. The changes in the neighborhood were subtle, but profound. More people were out walking. Neighbors who used to scurry from their cars to their front doors now stopped to chat on the sidewalk. The ever-present tension, the quiet fear that had settled over the community like a shroud, had lifted. As they neared Mrs. Gable's house, they saw her at the curb, struggling to lift a large bag of potting soil from the trunk of her car. Before Marcus could even offer to help, a Northwood police cruiser slowed to a stop. A young, bright-eyed officer with a name tag reading Peterson hopped out. "Let me get that for you, Mrs. Gable," he said with an easy smile, effortlessly hoisting the bag and carrying it up her walkway. "Are you planting mums for the fall?" "Oh, thank you, Officer Peterson. Yes, I thought the porch could use a bit of color," she replied, beaming. The interaction was simple, mundane even, but to Marcus it was monumental. This was proactive policing. This was community engagement. This was not a priority response or a statistic on a chart. It was a human connection. Eleanor watched the scene, a soft smile on her face. "He does that, you know," she said quietly to Marcus. "He knows everyone on the block by name. He and his partner, they get out of the car. They talk to people." Marcus nodded, a deep sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. He remembered the first town hall meeting Captain Isabella Rossi had held a month after taking command. The room had been packed, the air thick with years of pent-up anger and distrust. Residents shouted about being ignored, about the disrespect their children faced, about feeling like a forgotten part of the city. Captain Rossi didn't stand behind a podium. She walked among the crowd with a microphone, looking people in the eye, listening without interruption, and apologizing. "The trust between you and this department is broken," she had said, her voice clear and steady, "and we will not ask you to give it back to us. We will work, day in and day out, to earn it." It was the beginning of a long, arduous process, but it was an honest beginning. Later that day, back in his office overlooking the city, the weight of his own role came back into focus. The Northwood incident, as the press had dubbed it, had sent shockwaves through the state. On his desk was a report from the newly formed Police Accountability and Community Trust, PACT, task force, a body he had created to perform surprise audits on precincts across the state. The report detailed similar, if less egregious, patterns of neglect in 2 other major cities. His work was far from over. His phone rang, and the caller ID showed it was the head of the state's largest police union. Marcus braced himself and answered. The conversation was tense, with the union boss accusing him of a witch hunt and destroying morale. Marcus listened patiently before responding. "My office is not anti-police," he said, his voice firm but even. "We are pro-good policing. We are pro-accountability. The badge is a symbol of public trust, not a shield from public scrutiny. The vast majority of your officers are honorable public servants, and they deserve to work in a system that roots out the ones who betray that honor. We are making the system stronger, not weaker. He ended the call feeling the familiar exhaustion that came with fighting an entrenched culture. He was a hero to civil rights advocates, and a villain to the old guard. He had learned to live with the dichotomy. A notification popped up on his computer screen. It was a news alert. Ex-Police Sergeant Robert Evans sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for racketeering and obstruction of justice. He read the article. Miller and Davis, in exchange for their full cooperation, had been sentenced to 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. Captain Richards had been forced into retirement, his pension slashed, his career ending in a cloud of shame. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. He felt no thrill of victory, no jolt of triumphant revenge. He felt a profound and somber sense of finality. Evans wasn't just a bad cop. He was a symptom of a disease, a man who had been allowed to fester in a system that lacked oversight and rewarded apathy. Marcus hoped that 15 years was enough time for Evans to reflect on the lives he had damaged through his greed and neglect. As for Miller and Davis, perhaps their community service, working with the very people they had once dismissed, would teach them the lesson they had so brutally failed to learn in uniform. He stayed late that night, finishing his work before driving back to his mother's house. He found her in the kitchen, packing a slice of leftover apple pie for him to take home. The silver locket rested against her chest, gleaming in the warm light. "You work too hard," she said, handing him the container. "It was a busy day," he replied, accepting the pie. She looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, maternal understanding. "It's more than a job for you, isn't it? This changing the world." "I'm just trying to fix the broken parts, Mum, starting with our part of it." "Your father, he was a builder," she said, her gaze becoming distant for a moment. "He could fix anything in this house. But you rebuild things you can't even see. You rebuild trust. You rebuild hope." She gently touched the locket. "This was a promise from him to me. What you did, Marcus, it felt like you were keeping a promise to him. A promise to look after us, to make sure the world he left us was safe and fair." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had wielded the immense power of the state, brought down corrupt men, and initiated reforms that would affect millions. But in the end, it all came down to this simple, sacred promise: to protect his mother, to serve his community, to make things right. He hugged her good night and walked out into the cool autumn's air. The street was quiet, peaceful. A new dawn had broken over Oakdale, but he knew that dawns had to be defended every single day. The fight for justice wasn't a single battle. It was a tireless, unending vigil, and he was ready for the long watch ahead. This story is a powerful reminder that one person's courage can expose the deepest flaws in our institutions. Marcus Thorne's journey wasn't one of revenge, but of relentless accountability. He sought to fix a system that had forgotten its purpose, to protect everyone, not just the privileged few. The arrogance of those officers was their downfall. Blinded by prejudice, they never saw the power standing right in front of them. This story shows that a badge should be a symbol of trust and duty, and when that trust is broken, the consequences can be seismic. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story of karma and justice. What did you think of the officer's comeuppance? Let us know in the comments below.